Pete and I fret that we have a lot of material tonight, so maybe we should get started. And if that suits everyone, welcome to those who just joined. And let me begin with a piece that was just written by the composer John Rutter, and it's called A Ukrainian Prayer. And he is conducting this prayer, this piece, with the community choir of his parish at Clare College, Cambridge. So give me 1 second, and we will have this for our opening prayer and meditation.
Reach out to the Ukrainian people in their hour of need. Good Lord, protect the Ukraine. Give her strength, courage, faith, hope. Amen.
What I found in looking for music to open this evening, all across Europe, people are singing this new Ukrainian prayer that Rudder just composed. Youth choirs and universities and churches, cathedrals, communities. And I mean, it was, for me, a very moving experience just surfing the internet to see how many people are taking this seriously. So much like last night at Montview with the concert for Ukraine. This is happening in many, many places. Our question as we phrase it now is this: turning to God in crisis, is our faith shaken, affirmed, or transformed? And our working answer is embracing crisis in which God is the subject. Hesed, change, is a new creation. And that leads to a new question. Amidst all the calamity, where are grace and mercy? How and with whom shall a community of faith proceed? Is our faith today different than before COVID? So can we pause and hear from people whether your faith is different this Lenten season? Or is it different now than before COVID?
Well, I think for me, it's both transformed and the same, in the sense that I've always had some sort of faith, but I think it's been transformed for me personally about like the faith in science and figuring out, a vaccine. I have a spot right here because I'm of a certain age where I got a vaccine. I can't even remember what it is for. And to me, it's just a thing you do. You vaccinate your kids, you get a tetanus shot every 10 years. And I don't really think about it, but like thinking about it differently about what it means and how the studies go into that. I think my faith is greater in humanity and how humanity works with God-given principles to find out not new truths, but truths that we have yet to explore. That said, my faith in humanity, for certain people who refuse to get the vaccine, that's a different story too. But so it's both the same and yet transformed in a new understanding through science.
Thank you. I want to give Walter Brueggemann a shout out for challenging my faith. Just causing me to pause and examine the last 2 years with a renewed perspective of the importance of the covenant. That faith in God is both something personal and something collective. It's something that belongs in a community. And I find that remembrance, that reinvigoration of that to be very, very helpful, particularly in the course of this global challenge. Well, based on the prayer that we sent to Walter Brueggemann and our questions and comments, Tim and Clover recorded him in his basement in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan Friday evening. So we'll turn to that recording now, and it will go about 30 minutes, and then we will have a time for your response, your reflection on that. So you might be jotting down a thing or two if something in his comments strikes you as a pregnant thought. So let us begin with Clover, Tim, and Walter Brueggemann. And here we go.
Dr. Walter Brueggemann, the author of the book study that you all have been participating in, and Tim Beal, my spouse, so two of my very favorite Hebrew Bible scholars. We're so glad to be with Walter and his wife Tia for a couple of days. So we are here to be your session 5, I believe, to talk specifically about virus as a summons to faith, and Walter, why you wrote it and how impactful that study has already been on the church. I know that, and thank you for doing this, and thank you all for doing this study during this time. So, Walter, may I start by asking you how virus as a summons to faith came to you and why? And it was very early on in the pandemic.
It was. Well, I'm glad to get to be with the two of you, so that's terrific. Well, I write most days, and now that I'm old and retired, I can sort of write what I want, and obviously the virus has been all our minds, and I was thinking that it would be useful if one could make a response out of faith to do that. So what happened is what often happens to me. I just started writing, and it began to open up in this direction for me, and so I tried to sustain my thinking long enough to produce these pages.
Right.
And then as I told you, my editor added a couple little pieces to what I had written from earlier work of mine, and out came a little book.
Was the
Like the golden calf.
That's right, that's right.
much better, much better. Did you write it to be a study? Was the intentional format of, because every chapter
I
has
hadn't been that
questions.
specific about it. I think it immediately lent itself to that.
Yeah.
But I don't think I was thinking of that particularly at the time. I was just trying to factor out my own way of trying to make critical connections,
Right.
and that's what came.
So early. It was published in June of 2020.
Yep.
So very
Yep.
early
Yep.
on. Is there anything we didn't know this would be going for at least 2 years?
Right.
Anything that you would do differently or add to that book now that it's been going on? You've written, I think 4 books have come out during this pandemic,
Yeah.
so I know you've written other.
Well, I
wonderful,
think if I were
things.
to write it now, I undoubtedly would give different nuance and different accent to it.
Yeah.
But I don't think I'd change much about the basic argument that I tried to make. It's very tricky to try to talk about the relationship between God and virus without falling into direct causation, and I didn't want to do that.
Right.
So it was a sort of a delicate thing to do, and I might think of ways to do that differently now, but I think basically I wouldn't change very much.
Wonderful.
One of the the fields of question that that came up in the questions that we read from the group who's been studying the book, is around, well, it sort of gets prefaced with bracketing out magical thinking,
Yeah.
which is interesting, but and you might want to tie into that too, but to do with human impingement on God and and human influence on God, and and you also use that language of co-creating, I think, as well. I wonder if you want to.
Yeah. Well, I did see that phrase magical thinking, and I did want to comment on that. What I thought about it was that what I want to be engaged in is covenantal thinking. And covenantal thinking, which I think is pervasive in biblical faith, is that we and God constitute partners in a conversation in which we both have a role to play. And Serene Jones has given this marvelous wordplay in which he says, we have with God a relationship of mutuality and incommensurability. And I think that we have championed the incommensurability side of it, that we are so utterly different from God that we have neglected the mutuality. And I think that the Jewish tradition teaches us that we and God are in a two-way dialogic transaction. So the way I think about that is that our lives are given to us by the holiness of God, and our lives are lived back in faithfulness to the holiness of God, and that is the defining reality of our life. That's our vocation, is to be living our life back to the holiness of God. From the outside, that looks like magical thinking. From inside the metaphors of dialogue, there's nothing magical about it. It is a serious, ongoing, open-ended engagement between two parties who have deep things to do with each other. And so virus becomes a topic for the transaction between the holy God and us, and it's a very tricky transaction because there's so much we do not know, but we are under mandate to bring that kind of a topic to our defining conversation. So what I want to stress is that covenantal thinking from the outside looks like magical thinking, but our covenantal faith is not to be judged from the outside. It is to be judged from inside the relationship.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Well, this is a little bit off topic, but it makes me wonder whether almost all of the time when we characterize something as magical thinking, we're on the outside looking at something that seems primitive to us.
That's right.
Even when we're looking at other religious practices or beliefs that we're not familiar with, it's not magical thinking from the inside. There's another way of understanding that
That's
from
right.
the inside.
That's right.
But from the outside, we dismiss it. It's almost like saying primitive.
Yes, that's right.
Right.
And what I would say is that this conversation with the holiness of God is exceedingly primitive, but it is also exceedingly sophisticated.
Yeah.
And we work all of the thickness of that, I think. Yeah.
Do you think that incommensurability and mutuality, is that something like a paradox?
Yes, I think it is. I think it is a paradox, and we dare not fall out on either side of it, but we have to keep both of that working.
Right.
Traditional Calvinism, as you know, has emphasized the incommensurability, but what happens in soft American Calvinism is that we stress the mutuality side, that God is our good buddy and our best friend, and then we forget about the other side of it. So I think it's a process of endlessly correcting ourselves about that.
Hanging on to that
Yep.
tension.
Yeah, that's right.
Walter, you referenced a Jewish way of
Yep.
thinking about being in covenant
Yep.
with God. How different is that from liberal Protestantism?
Well,
I guess.
much, as you know, much of Christianity has been filtered through Greek philosophic categories. And that has led us to such, I would say, mistaken categories as omnipotence, omniscience, and omnipresence. And as much as I understand Judaism, that a Jewish way of thinking about God and knowing God has nothing to do with those omni formulae, because the main categories of faith are faithfulness, steadfast love, justice, righteousness, compassion. That is, they're all relational terms. And what has happened in very much of uncritical Christian theology is that we've traded off relational categories for very abstract philosophic categories, and that's bound to lead us to mistaken ways of practicing our faith, I think.
Right.
The good thing about those abstract categories is that they cohere nicely with Enlightenment rationality. But that's no good way to understand the faithfulness of God.
Right. And if we stay in that abstract distance, it feels like that relationship with God is so distant. It's, as a practitioner, it's hard to preach about an engaging, the living God, the dynamic relationship with God if God is there. It's hard to take the risk and preach about connection with the living God in a prayerful relationship, covenantal way. It seems, well, I guess
Yeah,
it's
so
it's
most of,
naive, I guess, or
I think that's right. Most of our wonderments about prayer arise from trying to make sense out of prayer by dealing with this abstraction.
Right.
Once you grant the point that these are covenantal partners who are in a thick relationship with each other, then prayer has a different kind of meaningfulness to us. But there are many pressures in our culture that want to talk us out of that covenantal way of thinking into Enlightenment ways of thinking that leave us much more in control. But what biblical faith insists upon is that it is relationality all the way down. And our lives consist in practicing honest, mature relationality as best we can. We have to keep learning that and practicing it and finding better ways to practice that, but that's what our faith is about.
Say more about the word mature. What do you mean by that?
Well, I used it very intentionally, so I think mature means, so to say, that this is not a childish transaction. This is a transaction in which adults can honestly and fully participate as adults without dumbing down or without playing games or without being manipulative, just as we think about a serious adult relationship doesn't cheapen itself by those kinds of stratagems. That's what I think I mean. Yeah. And I was thinking about Paul saying, when I was a child, I did so and so, but now I put away childish things. All of that. And I think Paul uses the word mature, it uses patriarchal language, grown up into mature manhood,
Right,
or mature womanhood,
Sure.
or whatever. Yeah,
Right.
act like an adult in the
Yeah,
presence of
yeah,
God.
the manipulation is
Yeah.
not there, yeah.
I'm thinking about in the title and your language around summons and making, thinking about a virus as a summons
Yep.
in that sense, and the ways, this virus is arguably, maybe not, but probably a natural occurrence.
Right.
Um, and within biblical tradition, and I think in the larger Christian and Jewish faith traditions as well, we have these experiences of nature as violent: storms, fires, earthquakes, floods, and pandemics,
Right.
as somehow identified with God.
Yeah.
Whether as literally acts of God, as they're sometimes put, or just this sort of experience of being overwhelmed by a violent, chaotic nature as a kind of religious experience. As a, Rudolf Otto talked about that kind of being overwhelmed with the feeling of creatureliness
Right.
as kind of one of the maybe the origins of all the ways faith kind of unpacks in terms of that relationality that you were just talking about. I just wonder if you might reflect a little more on that, on the notion of violent to us.
Yeah.
And we could argue that it's natural in the
That's
larger
right, that's right.
is part of a larger ecosystem.
Yeah,
Fire is too.
Yeah.
But when we have that kind of experience of being subjected to virus, but that is somehow also summons.
Right. Well, I think it's summons in the sense that we have an obligation to bring our best faith thinking to everything that is in front of us. So if the virus is in front of us, then we have to, as best we can, mobilize our best thinking about what are the resources of faith. Not that we'll solve the virus, we're not into problem solving, but that will equip me to live faithfully in the face of the virus. I think the practical end of it, how shall I live, is the ultimate question of all of this. And so, what is there about the virus that is summoning me or inviting me to take on a new sense of my life as a mature person? And how do I respond to that? With believing that somehow these worst violences are not disconnected from the holiness of God, even though we do not know how to talk about the connectedness.
Right. I wonder if in some ways, the primitive, quote unquote, origins, early cultural practices and experiences of, ancient Israelite, ancient Near Eastern people that are the environmental context in the Bible in which in those early, that are kind of traced into our biblical texts, whether those cultural contexts in which humans were more subjected to
Right.
natural forces that were dangerous and deadly
Yeah.
might be informing in some ways this biblical faith.
Well, I
that
think
you're
they are.
talking about.
For all of our best scientific learning, we are still standing in front of a great mystery that we cannot decode.
Right.
And we think we know more and think better. But finally, I think with Otto, we are left in awe and wonder and sometimes fear, and those are the realities of our life.
And yet they summon us to resources to try to alleviate suffering.
That's
to
right,
try to
that's right.
create
What are
community and
the-
neighborliness.
Yeah, what are the
Right.
resources that we can mobilize to be responsible adults in the face of this reality?
Not just paralyzing.
That's correct, that's right.
Walter, what about you personally? What has this virus summons to you in your own faith? Has it shaped or changed for you?
Well, it has caused me to go back and reconsider in the Bible such places as the whirlwind speeches in Job, in which the sort of outrageous hiddenness of God looms so powerfully. So I have been thinking about how we get so comfortable that we tend to imagine that God fits into our calculus. Now, in terms of practical behavior, maybe that's what T and I have tried to support ministries financially that are addressing the needs in the midst of all of this, that sort of thing.
You talk a lot about biblical faith, the biblical God, or the God of the Bible.
Yeah.
Say more about what you mean by biblical.
Well, I mean the complex disjunctive testimony. Disjunctive means it doesn't all fit together.
Yes.
Disjunctive testimony about the Old and New Testaments, in which Israel and the early church keep walking around the holiness of God and offering the best testimonies of what we think we see and what we know and what we hear, that the next day in the next testimony are contradicted. And I think that biblical faith is a collage of all of these pieces that ill fit together. Having said that, we think, people that do work like Tim and me, we think that you can identify some recurring patterns or constancies that become the main accent points of what we mean when we speak summarily of biblical faith. And that's what I was doing when I used the word covenant and the functions of covenant in terms of justice, righteousness,
Right.
compassion, steadfast love, and faithfulness, those big five, that you can see the people in the Bible are struggling to make sense out of their lives through these categories. And in the midst of that, they experience God to be unfaithful. So faithfulness is a theme, but they are very honest about the unfaithfulness of God. Compassion is a major theme, but they are very honest in needing compassion that they don't get. And so the work of interpretation is the process of adjudicating all of these witnesses. And what we, as you know very well, what we tend to do, we pick out the ones we like, and we pretend that that's all there's there. And if you look seriously in the Bible, there's always a dissenting testimony to whatever claim you make, and then we have to adjudicate that.
They have a question about chesed, and just talk about what, I think that the question is, I don't know if it's particular.
And then the fourth one, the fifth one, let's see, I am,
Yeah, abiding. Right. So I have friends battling cancer with the social totality of engaging their relentless, uncompromising hope. Those are quotes. And abiding hesed, tenacious solidarity of God.
yeah,
But just talk about hesed and that description of that characteristic of God, or that quality.
well, I have translated that as tenacious solidarity,
Mhm.
which I have the image of a bulldog that takes a bite and will not turn it loose no matter what. And God is like that in God's tenacious love for the world. Now, I think what this question reflects is that Christian faith has no solution to the problem of evil. Nobody has a solution to the problem of evil, and we're no better off than anybody else. So the two responses that we tend to make about the problem of evil is that we hope for another life or another world, or somehow it'll get better by the mercy of God. But the Jewish response to evil is basically to engage in lament and complaint, to speak truth to power, to pray truth to God, and if necessary, to accuse God of violating God's chesed. And they do that all the time in the
Right.
lament psalms and so on.
Stay in the game.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Psalm 89, which is a long psalm, I don't know, I think the first 37 verses talk about how wonderful this all is with God's hesed and hesed. Very repetitious. And then there's some leap into the next verse that says, "Where is your hesed? I don't see your hesed. I don't see your hesed anywhere." So, you know, Tia has a story of herself when she was a petulant 13-year-old, and she was with her family, and her mother said, "Oh, look at the beauty." And Tia said, "Beauty? I don't see any beauty. Where's the beauty?" And that's the way Israel is about hesed. "I don't see any hesed. Where's the hesed?" And so Israel in its experienced loss of hesed, has to pray vigorously back into God's face. And I think probably, I haven't had cancer, but if you have cancer and you're dying from it, you might have a loss of hesed, and you have to get back at it. Yeah.
So don't talk, it's not exactly the same as trying to solve for the problem of evil. It's just to continue to complain and lament.
That's right. How to
about
be
the
an
problem of
adult.
evil. Yeah.
given the realities of one's life.
Mhm.
Yeah.
One thing I think the church, even our own church, hasn't done well during this pandemic and other crises that have gone on during these 2 years is have opportunities for collective lament,
Yep.
complaint.
Yep.
I suppose prayers and petitions,
Yeah.
or our perfunctory lists of petitions and
Yes.
our very domesticated prayers that we have in our liturgies, but just that raw lament and complaint, there are few places to do that,
Everything
and we're
in our,
not schooled to do that.
everything in our culture pushes against that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the church has largely accepted that domestication of our prayers and
Right.
of our faith.
Yeah.
That's right.
Well, it's back to what you said. If it feels primitive, and as good liberals, we're a little embarrassed
Yep.
to speak like that, or
Yeah.
to actually believe that our prayers are evocative to God's
Yeah. Yeah.
attention.
And
Will
that
it
means
covenant?
trying to reformulate our faith in relational covenantal categories.
Right.
If we do that, then that
Then we do
conversation makes more sense.
Right.
Yeah.
We have to stay in the Old Testament Hebrew Bible and keep in those stories and those
right.
conversations.
That's right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we don't stay there long
Yeah.
enough.
Yeah.
You know.
But even in the New Testament, I think it's in Luke 18 where Jesus tells the parable about how to pray, and it is really the parable is about a widow who nags
Yes.
the judge
Yes.
till the judge gives in,
Yes.
and
That's
Jesus
right.
says, "Pray like that."
Pray like that.
So it's in the New Testament too.
That's fair. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well,
That's good.
Another of the questions kind of came around to human suffering versus other kinds of non-human suffering, the prophetic cry is the prophetic cry as much for the environment as for non-human beings on God's earth. These intertwined calamities and that. And I was thinking I may have misread the question, but I was thinking that, there is at least a kind of poetic intuition around the connectedness of environmental justice and social justice
Right.
in the prophets. You think about one of your favorite passages, Jeremiah 4, where, breaking Torah and practicing injustice invokes a kind of vision of uncreation,
That's
of the
right.
whole order of creation falling apart. And Isaiah maybe 24 to 27 in there somewhere,
Yeah.
there's this interaction of social breakdown and environmental
Yeah.
breakdown
Yeah.
kind of envisioned. And
Yeah.
it's not a direct connection, but during this time, I think, especially during the pandemic, we've been very aware of the ways the pandemic has been, has unequally affected different people depending on
Right.
Right.
socioeconomic class and race and
That's right.
ethnicity and
Yeah.
many other factors. And then, of course, the murder of George Floyd and, Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery and the protests. And
Right.
so the virus time and social justice are
Oh.
very much all together. And then layering onto that, the heightened consciousness during this pandemic time of climate crisis and
Right.
the
Right.
potential for real systemic collapse.
Yeah.
And so we're in the midst of a kind of environmental crisis that is also a social justice crisis, and they're impacting each other. And the biblical tradition kind of, gets at that, I think almost in a more poetic way, but I'd love to hear you speak more.
Well, I
to
think
that.
I think that the prophetic tradition regards all creatures, rocks and possums and pumpkins. They're all covenantal creatures in a relationship with the Creator,
Mhm.
and it is according to Genesis, the human responsibility to be at work on behalf of all of those other creatures for their well-being. So we have obligations for the well-being of all of creation, and we've sort of separated that in our faith as though that wasn't central. But I think on the whole, just what you're saying, the Bible refuses to make those distinctions between human creatures and non-human creatures. We are all creatures. We are all gifted by the Creator. We are all living our lives back to the Creator. So the Psalms 147 and 148 can imagine all of these other creatures joining in the doxology and praising God. And if they can all praise God, we can imagine they can all lament.
Nice. And they do, right?
They do.
The land mourns and
the storms cry out.
Yeah.
That's right. Exactly.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Yeah, nice place.
So we'll stop at that point and rejoin the three of them for our closing prayer. But what thoughts do you have in response to Walter Brueggemann?
He makes so much sense, and hearing him directly is so incredible. I was thinking today as I watched it earlier and thinking about, I wonder if I would have less difficulty reading him sometimes if he were reading it to me, the books to me. And for those of you who weren't here in 2008, he came in 2008 as one of our speakers. Remember Peter when he was here then? And he was here again in 2016. And then he and Clover had a 219 where they had a special of the book that they did together. So each time he comes, it's a renewal of this incredible man of faith and of brilliance and a few other things. My thoughts.
So a side industry of audio tapes of Brueggemann take up that challenge. What else? Peter, I remember you mentioned you had one line in there that you found provocative, that Christian faith has no solution to evil.
Would you say more about what I said, because I've forgotten what I said?
Well, I remember over coffee, you said that there was one line there that you found really interesting and challenging. Christian faith has no solution to evil. And then David will go to your question after this.
So I wanted to wrestle a little bit with that. What do we mean by solution? Do we mean that, yes, we can explain why the virus appeared here, did that mutation there, in the same way that maybe we could explain how the cosmos originated? Can we figure all those things out? And sometimes I think we do think we can do that. But to say that we have not enough to offer is not quite faithful to the rest of what Brueggemann teaches us, is that we have plenty to offer here. Just not to imagine that faith or biology or astronomy or the wisdom of the Enlightenment says that no, there are no mysteries anymore. We've got it all figured out. The cosmic mysteries, your cancer, whatever else. I think he's calling us to say we got a lot to do. God calls us to do a lot.
His comment was in the context of comparing what we often see in both evangelical and liberal traditions of the church in America with the Jewish tradition, which is much more ready to lament and complain and protest out loud and publish in a psalm for all time that disjunctive, sometimes incoherent, problematic faith. So I take part of his answer as being in that space between what we expect and the fact that maybe our polity, our church polity is too polite. David, what was your comment or response?
Actually, I'll go ahead and make a response on that one, on the evil thing. You know, in that conversation with Brueggemann, I think they were talking about God's tenacious love of the world for the world. And then he said Christianity does not have a solution for evil, but it arose out of a conversation and conflict between the way the Jewish, look at their covenant faith and how they use the word Christianity, but I don't know if evangelistic or what the there's a what I feel and certainly why we go to a traditional congregation is that in a lot of cases Christianity gets watered down in the way that people look at things, and they look at things through emotion, and it causes more of a separation than a closeness. And like you said, this covenant relationship with God is, from the outside looks like a miracle. So, some of these folks that can't get deep in their religion, they have this emotional state, and they don't see the realities of things. So that's my comment on what you all just said. But the comment that I wanted to make in terms of Brueggemann and maybe what I've kind of gotten out of this study is that, personally, I don't blame God for this virus. I don't blame God for calamities. But, I feel that sometimes we get away from thinking about God and we think about ourselves only. And if we think about ourselves and we're just looking inward, we're not outward to help and do the things that we as Christians need to do, as being part of the faith community. And so what I liked in that conversation and being able to actually directly, talk to the author himself is, he made the statement that we need to bring out our best faith thinking. And so again, why, and through our study, from last week of the I to thou, we need to put God first in our thinking. So we need to get out of this. Yeah, I mean, regardless, look, I've had cancer before personally. My wife has had cancer. We both are cancer survivors. And so, you can get overwhelmed by thinking about yourself, and you have to get out of that mode of thinking, and you have to put God first. And first of all, by doing that, it gives you strength. It gives you hope to get away from thinking about yourself and thinking about God. And then through that process, and what Brueggemann said tonight is, we have an obligation to bring our best faith thinking to the situation. So now, when we think of the war in Ukraine, what is happening? Look at these chefs that are delivering meals, and going into areas, putting their own lives at risk. And some of these people are not from Ukraine. Look at the world response to that conflict. Look at the connectivity, the way that's brought together NATO. Look at what you brought out with the hymn, and so forth, the singing, and faith reaching out to the Ukrainians. This is what Brueggemann's talking about. Put our best faith thinking forward. And so that's kind of what I got out of that. Over.
Excellent. A responsibility and an obligation on the behalf of all of our neighbors. And that stretches from Denver to Kiev. But what I liked very much at the end, and this was in response to the question posed by Maureen about nature and the environment, our obligation extends to the rocks, the possums, and the pumpkins too. So it's a full agenda. And you're right, it's very active, serious, mature thinking and action based on our faith.
Yeah, just to dovetail on what Dave was saying, and that's what I was sort of coming to, was the interconnectedness that we're seeing, and then reading the articles that we were sent, talking about the fuel fossil war, the climate. It's definitely our interconnectedness of God to people, to the earth, to people, human community on the earth. And that's just kind of seems to really be the theme. Yeah. Which is the covenantal thinking. Yeah.
And the covenantal thinking part of it makes me think of like the Native American tribes would say, think of the seventh generation that is coming, and all the covenants that they made with, to raise the corn. They sacrificed a fish, which essentially was fertilizer, but like they had this very intimate relationship with nature, hence God, the Great Spirit, and our enlightened souls. I'm going to disagree with the part that says some of that emotion gets in the way. It's actually, from a psychological point of view, it's the emotion that connects us to. And if we are not emotional, like, oh, I'm so emotional, but like if we have an emotional connection and attachment to our world, then we will take care of the world differently.
I love Walter's phrase, the outrageous hiddenness of God. It was such a classic Walter Brueggemann phrase. Just acknowledging that it is sometimes, and that's maddening.
Yep. If you think back, Mary Jo, to the first chapter where he gives us those three trajectories: covenantal, law, holiness of God, and that intentional purpose of God. That outrageousness is part of understanding the holiness of God. And he said at the very beginning, our lives are given to us by the holiness of God. And then he says a bit later, our vocation is to be living back to the holiness of God. So it's outrageous, it's incomprehensible, it's incommensurate, that term that Tim and you were batting back and forth. And to David's point, it's also very closely connected. We're to live back to that. I loved his helpful explanation of how much of our Christian thinking is influenced by Hellenism, by the Greeks, by the abstract omni-formulae, omniscience, omnipotence, omnipresence, and the Judaic correction to that is the very close, emotive, evocative relationship. So much to think about. Any other comments, or shall we try to address what else was there in chapters 6 and 7? It would be perfectly all right to do this for the rest of the evening, but we can also just try to touch on some of the other points that were raised this week. Rita, go ahead.
Can I just, since I missed last week, and it seemed like there was a lot of discussion with Brueggemann about magical thinking versus covenantal thinking. And I guess I was trying to remember whether we had talked about magical thinking the weeks before that, and I couldn't remember that we had. So I'm trying to get to the basis of what was magical thinking and why did it, or I get what he's talking about, covenantal thinking, but where did we, or where did magical thinking come from? Does anybody have any input as to?
That came from chapter 4 on prayer, and the wording is his.
Okay. I was
So-
there with that one, so.
We were looking in depth at all the ways in which we pray. And one of his critiques was the magical thinking in prayer. And then that led Brueggemann and Tim to talk about how we can pray boldly. And back to that quote that we talked about quite a bit from Karl Barth, that we can affect God through our prayer.
Right.
Bring God into existence through our prayer. The outside world might look at that kind of covenantal faith as magical thinking. But if you are grounded and rooted so thoroughly and deeply in that kind of relationship, it's part of the covenantal exchange. It's part of I-thou relationship.
I'd like to say, I don't think that magical thinking, magical praying is as unfamiliar to us as we think. There are those letters written to Santa in December. Dear Santa, I need a red wagon and a new computer, and I know I'm only 7, but I need a sports car and a big garage. Well, you know, Santa's not going to bring that. And so this business about, you know, just ask God for anything you want and God will give it. That's that sort of Santa superimposed on the divine. I think that's but let's add something to that. Isn't it okay for our prayers to be untheological? Isn't that all right to ask for something, and in the very praying, it's almost the equivalent of a lament. Say, dear God, my friend has cancer. Fix it, God. Doesn't God welcome that prayer? Does that mean answer or embrace?
Just having you say that, Peter, I have a client who is Jewish, and she calls her father Abba all the time. To me, you know, when we talk, Dad or Abba, but like since I've been working with more and more Jewish people of faith, that word Abba has become for me more personal, whereas, you know, growing up the way I did, you know, it's the only time you hear it is once in a while when you talk. I mean, Mormons don't really do Easter and Holy Week, so once in a while you talk about, you know, that Jesus was hanging on the cross and cried out, Abba, Father, but that seems so, you know, Abba, Father there is God with the white beard and white flowing robes, but like it's become more personal. So what you just said made me think of all of that. So and so, and the next part is like, yeah, wouldn't you go to Daddy? I mean, this is really what we're saying. Daddy, help me. Daddy, help me do this. And sometimes Dad can help and sometimes Daddy can't.
But you've articulated the desire, in articulating it, God does God's own work in that, saying, yeah, I just said that prayer. Thank you, God.
Hey,
Thank you
so
for that parking spot.
to both Pete and David. So when I made my other comments, I was trying to react to Brueggemann's comments about Christianity and the Greek relationship, of omnipresence. And what Brueggemann said is that omnipresence traded off relational categories to abstract categories and may mislead us. And so there's a potential separation of connectedness. And so that's why he has us going back to this covenant relationship with God. And so it's not the magical thinking from people looking at things from the outside that don't understand. It's based on that personal relationship that we have with God, where he's first in our lives. And we have that relationship. And we know maybe that not all of our prayers are going to be answered in the way that you say during Christmas with the red wagon, but that he's with us during even the toughest times. So when I had cancer, I needed that presence. I needed that oneness to get through all of that. And what a joy to be a cancer survivor. I feel fortunate. And so I don't totally understand the theological position in all cases that Brueggemann comes from, because he is so deep. And so I'm trying to understand, but it is bringing my thinking that God is first, and that through him all things are possible. And so we don't want things that separate us from that. And I see people that try to build off of emotion. And yes, it is an emotional experience, but at the same time, the depth of that emotion doesn't reach, it doesn't reach that connectedness. And so that's where the education, the reading, the understanding deeper into the theological concepts of the Bible probably help us quite a bit to refocus, to make sure that we are thinking in the right ways. So that's, I was sort of reacting to that and trying to understand it in my comments. Over.
It's really interesting. I just realized I had a big magical prayer for a certain amount of time. It went something like, God, if I read the Book of Mormon and Bible and fast and pray enough, maybe I won't be gay. And the irony is that in figuring out that it's okay to be okay, it's okay to be gay, I actually have a closer relationship with God than in all of those magical, that part of magical thinking prayer.
Thank you for that comment and all the comments. Peter, did you want to speak to Sat? So I put that.
Do you want to bring up that painting I think we showed on our video that we'll show next week? But this is a painting by a French-born artist, painted let's say 4 or 5 generations ago. And this is a guy named Jacques Tissot. And he moved to England and figured it was not good to be able to not good to speak French, so he changed his name to James Tissot. But but whatever we want to call him, he painted this picture, which you'll see in a minute here. This is a picture of Tissot's thought about what the exile from Babylon might have looked like just as it was beginning.
I apologize for.
I can see Dan working on it there. We can probably get you a clearer shot, which I think that's going to be good. What's cut off at the top is actually flames coming out of the city of Jerusalem and the temple. And a picture of the Israelites fleeing from the burning city. And you can see there in the front, those 3 or 4 guys dressed up. They are the goons from Putin. Oh, I didn't mean to say, I meant to say the kings of Babylon, who are right there saying, your time's up, you Israelites, you're going to be walking to Babylon. And you might notice that these people are pretty well dressed. I don't know if it's fair to say that or not, but the biblical record says that it was the highly educated folks whom the Babylonians took off to take along to Moscow, Babylon. And so one of the benefits we think of reading these wonderful biblical stories is not just the theology that bubbles up from them, but our understanding of who these people are and finding a way, in what way do we share their journey? In what way is their journey like ours? So here you go. We have paid a lot of attention to war and virus. We know that there's hunger. We know that there are other things happening too. In terms of the virus, I would be bold enough to assert that picture shows us kind of the way we were a couple years ago. Now that's a bold statement. We were not being thrown out of our houses. We were not being told to walk 1,000 miles to a strange city. We were not being told to walk away from the temple, which the place we, in their imagination, was where God lived, not elsewhere, but a misery. And so think, if you would, this is kind of first Isaiah, the predictions of how things are coming together, and people are disobedient. This is what Isaiah see happening. This is where we're going. And then, as you know, the Isaiah stories continued with further authors. And the last few chapters are about the Isaiah coming back into Jerusalem. And I would assert that maybe that we have something to learn from that biblical story too. Here are the people thinking, aha, the end is near. The hospitalizations are lower. We have remembered that second Isaiah told us that the road would be clear and the valleys would be exalted and the plains be made level. And we're on our way back to something like normal. And lo and behold, we are finding that life's different from how it was. So again, 2 generations after that picture, we see that yeah, they're heading back, but not quite knowing what they're going to run into. What they found was a Jerusalem in tatters. I don't think we're in shape like that. So maybe we can identify with the story here. Yes, in a small sense, that's their story, and let's link in with that little bit too. Feel free to groan. Dan, what's your best wisdom? Should we talk about some generation things, or should we begin moving on towards our close and closing with Dr. Brueggemann's prayer? Where would you think it'd be a good way to take these last 7 minutes we have?
Well, his closing prayer is 4 minutes. So why don't we take 3 minutes to do our wrap, and then we can close with his prayer. There's still a lot that we haven't talked about from chapters 6 and 7. And Pete and I would also like to discuss with you where to from here, which would be our focus next week. And we already know what Pete wants. It's a red wagon, but I think we can be very bold and concrete and think covenantally, and also think in whatever ways we know to think faithfully. So why don't we not rush into the generational stuff, because that's pretty rich and deep, and you've given that an enormous amount of thought. So we'll save that for next week. Are there any other closing thoughts folks have on engaging with Walter Brueggemann through Tim and Clover before we turn to his prayer?
Well, I'd just like to say that I think I resonated most with the last chapter, 7, with the groaning. That's where I am. I am groaning. I am groaning. And I kind of felt comforted that that's okay. And I'm not quite there yet with thinking that it's going to result in the birth of something new. And that doesn't sit too well with me either, because I think magical thinking is that, oh yeah, something wonderful is going to happen after all these pains. But the groan, I'm in the groan phase. So thank you, Walter Brueggemann, for giving me a right to groan.
I think Dr. Brueggemann would respond to you with a gesture, and I think it would go like this. It's a little bit like Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, there was a bit of Bernie there for sure. That thought came through my mind. And I also realized watching that video that Tim set up with his iPhone, so you could see his legs bouncing for the entire 40 minutes. He's got the same restless leg syndrome I have. Okay, any other closing comments before we turn to his prayer? And Rita, the next thing that we do turn to, what Pete and I have prepared, is the big groan. But your second point is very well taken. How do you go from the big groan to something new? Okay. And those are wonderful, pregnant thoughts for stepping into Holy Week and imagining how our faith guides us in this. Okay, I'll go back to share screen, and it will be the closing 4 minutes with Walter Brueggemann. And I'll try to get it so the lip sync is there. I'm not sure why there was a little bit of delay there, but I'll try.
Well, Walter has graciously offered to finish us with a prayer that he wrote just a few days ago.
Yeah.
And we would love to hear it.
All right. This prayer is a reflection on the story in John 9 where there's a blind boy and people are arguing about who caused his blindness, and then Jesus heals the boy. So that's what I was thinking. We live conveniently in our homemade cages of explanation. We live comfortably in our cages of cause and effect. We liberals live in our cages of being smarter and more woke. We conservatives live in our cages of being better grounded and more reliable. In our cages of ideology, we sense our control, our ability to explain, our capacity to link cause to effect, to connect deed to consequence. Our cages are self-justifying. We never question them, and the world is made morally sensible. We win the blame game every time. We reason backward from consequence to deed, from effect to cause, and our arithmetic never fails us. But then sometimes, not often, but often enough, your wonders elude our explanations, your miracles violate our confident calculations. Once in a while, healing breaks through. Generosity overwhelms our arithmetic. Forgiveness moves beyond our reasoning. Hospitality exposes our careful management. Beyond our expectation comes your freighted holiness. New sight for the blind, new walking for the lame, new hearing for the deaf, new possibility for the poor, new freedom, new well-being, new joy, all beyond our caged explanations. Your holiness breaks our numbness. Your holiness mocks our moral control. Your holiness opens life beyond our blame games. We pause in awe before your transformative power. We move beyond our management. We mount up with wings like eagles. We run in eagerness and not tired. We walk in well-being and do not grow faint. We are made well beyond our best selves. It is no wonder that we break out in loud praise, lost in wonder at your goodness, lost in love for the new world you give, lost in praise for you alone. Amen.